Well, what was your vision behind big wires and that concept with transmission?
When you look at the components of where you have cheap electricity, where you have expensive electricity, oftentimes you've got renewable electricity, renewable clean electricity in places where it doesn't have much value, and yet we don't have the transmission to get to the place where it does have value.
But there's a lot of oil and gas, and certainly in our service territory. How do you talk to people who say, gee, we want to go 100% renewable on one hand and also protect the valuable oil and gas assets? How do you meet that balance?
There's a dynamic relationship between cost and the cost of adapting, and how clean the energy is in terms of its final, what all the costs involved are. Having been a geologist, I see that other side, but again, also being a scientist.
Well, I see the senator is here. I'm doing great, sir. How are you?
Good.
It is my true honor to introduce one of my senators from Colorado, Senator Hickenlooper. He's got a very interesting path to getting to become senator, and he doesn't remember this. We first met in the Denver airport when I was running the Western Area Power Administration. But one of the reasons I moved to Colorado was before I lived there, I went to this little brew pub. And I thought, any downtown area that has a brew pub is a place that I want to live. So the senator in the past, besides being a geologist, which certainly helps at United Power, where we've got a lot of oil and gas wells, also was the mayor for a number of years in Denver, and actually led the city in a major change in everything from affordable housing, which was phenomenally impressive. Certainly as governor, you did a tremendous job, and now as our U.S. Senator, we really appreciate you being here, sir.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you for that kind word. Let me just talk for a few minutes before we sit down and do the questions. We're at a real inflection point. I think pretty much everyone sees that in terms of almost everything, if you step back and really think about it. But we've been at these points a lot. It's funny, my great-grandfather, who I rarely talk about, but a guy named Andrew Hickenlooper, who was one of the youngest generals in the Civil War. He was from Cincinnati, well, actually Hudson, but just outside Cincinnati. And he built all the bridges on Sherman's March to the Sea. In the siege of Vicksburg, he's the one who had the idea to tunnel under the redoubt and then blow it up. So he supervised all those operations. And he came back to Cincinnati, and since he was a war hero, everybody trusted him. And in those days, every little neighborhood was setting up their own electric company. And there were power lines. You look at some of the pictures from the late 1880s, or I guess all 1880s and 1890s. It was visual chaos, which was even worse functionally. And he was someone they trusted, so as they had to do roll-ups, merging together one after another, who gets more value, how do you assess this new technology, what is the real value of it? He wrote a couple of early books on electrical generation and, more importantly, electrical transmission. So I just say that so you listen to what I say. I look at this as a component. I look at climate change. I know I'm on the outside of the argument these days, but I still feel a great sense of urgency that we have to move faster to get to a cleaner energy future. And as Mark said, I'm all of the above. I think we've got to recognize that working people need to have energy, and it's going to be all kinds of energy for a good while. But we need to be building towards that clean energy future. And one of the key ingredients, which you all know, is making sure that our grid is of sufficient capacity and technology to do what we need to get done what we need to be done. And this is one of those moments where there's enough, there's been enough fighting, enough battles, and this shouldn't be a partisan issue. More than almost anything, I look at the issues around a transition to cleaner energy as truly bipartisan. And cost does matter, right? And making sure that we don't put an insufferable burden on working people by letting energy costs get, rise and get away from us. But recognizing that we are ultimately going to a place where we want to make sure that we have not just cleaner air to breathe and all the benefits you get from clean energy, but that we're also able to look at climate change. And every week, I'm sure many of you in the room pay attention to it, things like the chemistry of the ocean and what that does to plankton and how big that is as part of our food chain. These are things that are insufficiently studied. And I spent a bunch of time in the last couple of months reading up on, there's a society. Who knew there were so many societies? Supposedly, I was told that there are 93,000 trade associations in the United States now. If you think that makes our jobs easy, you're confused. But there is a society for decision making with deep uncertainty. Is that your world? And I think that's the issue, is that we are going to have a lot of variables and a lot of uncertainty, and that we need to, regardless of that, we need to make decisions faster. And there are a bunch of, at a point of inflection, things like the permitting bill, which is, again, not going to turn the world upside down, but it's going to make significant changes if we get it passed. And I think it's got a very good chance of getting passed, because a lot of people on both sides of the aisle realize that we can't spend this amount of time making sure that we have transmission is the good example to use this morning, but that we need this infrastructure in various types of infrastructure to do much more rapidly what needs to be done. So that's if you come away from one thing today, it's that recognition that we've got to do a better job of making decisions. And there's a bunch of processes, this whole notion of making decisions with deep uncertainty. There are a bunch of processes you can go through to make better decisions when you have uncertainty, and how to weight and risk weight some of that uncertainty. We've got to have a sense of urgency about how we go that. And trust me, our democracy, our form of government is not designed to move quickly. But from time to time, if a democracy is going to last, it better be adaptable and to a certain extent resilient. I think we're going to see that here in the next decade or two to see whether we really can make these decisions fast enough. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much for all the support that you've given us. So about a little over a year ago, you introduced Big Wires. We endorsed it here as part of GridWise. I know that's morphed a little bit into permitting. Well, what was your vision behind Big Wires and that concept with transmission?
Sure. And Big Wires really was toward a wise grid. When you look at the components of where you have cheap electricity, where you have expensive electricity, oftentimes you've got renewable electricity, renewable clean electricity in places where it doesn't have much value, and yet we don't have the transmission to get to the place where it does have value. And when we first walked through and looked at the differences and how much revenue there was and value that was being stranded, trying to figure out ways that we can build interregional transmission and make sure we're not trying to take away anybody's rights, or make sure that everybody's fairly compensated for their costs and their risk. That seemed an appropriate use of government, is to try and facilitate and accelerate building that more resilient. I think of it like the 50s transportation system that Dwight D. Eisenhower looked at and said, we've got all these cities, and we've got this new thing, this automobile that's sweeping the nation, but we really can't get from one place to another very efficiently. And we can't move goods and products from one place to another efficiently. And so he created the interstate system. Well, we really need to have that kind of an approach, I think, to our electrical transmission and our grids.
So Colorado I always describe as probably a perfectly purple state, even though obviously both senators are on the Democrat side. But there's a lot of oil and gas, and certainly in our service territory. How do you talk to people who say, gee, we want to go 100% renewable on one hand and also protect the valuable oil and gas assets? How do you meet that balance?
Well, I think I got a master's in what they called back then, it was the first year they changed it to Earth and Environmental Science. The year before I got there, it was geology. And I did it, I started studying geology because it was interesting and engaging, but also it was a career where you could get paid handsomely to go walk and hike and spend a big chunk of your life in the most beautiful landscapes on Earth. And I think almost without exception, every geologist I knew was an environmentalist. But we all recognized that we drove cars, we flew in airplanes, we watched television, turned our lights on and off, that we all needed energy. And we wanted to make sure that we did everything we could to keep that energy reliable and clean and affordable as much as we could. And I think that's the point we've got to get to, is recognition that most people in the energy industry in no way are champions of pollution or dirty energy. There's a dynamic relationship between cost and the cost of adapting, and how clean the energy is in terms of its final, what all the costs involved are. And having been a geologist, I see that other side, but again, also being a scientist. And according to Mark Kelly, the astronaut from Arizona, I'm the only real scientist in the Senate. I said, well, Kelly, you're a scientist. You've been to space. You've done experiments in space. He says, yeah, but I've never published a peer-reviewed paper, which you have, Hickenlooper. He said with a little bit of disdain. And he said that I didn't design the experiments that I performed. Someone else was thinking through what was the information we're trying to get, and how do we go about that. And I think that's the challenge right now, is we are dangerously close to let's call it an anti-scientific ripple going through society that we should all be paying attention to. And we want to make sure that we stay in a universe that's fact-based, and we have lots of processes to try and get to what is science saying, what are the real facts on this issue. And we've got to recognize that science isn't perfect. Science is constantly, or should be, reevaluating itself and measuring, here's what I thought 10 years ago, here's what I thought 20 years ago, here's what I think now, and here are the reasons why I've got new information, why I'm taking that in. My phone, is this my wife? I might have to pick it up. Nope, not my wife. I always did that. If it was my wife, I'd pick it up and then I'd introduce you all to her. That she's horrified, but in the end, I always get brownie points. More from the wife than the audience. I understand that. Anyway, I think that's the challenge for a lot of us now, is that we've got to kind of walk that line between facts that sometimes aren't what people want to hear, and finding ways to make sure that they do hear it. And again, I believe that neither side is wrong on this battle over, whether climate change is real or not, how much of it's man-made, how fast is it going. There's just a whole lot of complexity and a lot of uncertainty, and we're still sorting our way through that. But I think as those facts emerge and as we get to a consensus, I think we'll get to the right place, but we just have to get there faster.
Well, you opened up one of the first offices of sustainability in the country. You talked about the fact that your geology degree was rebranded. One of the conversations we had yesterday is, given the new incoming political environment, things like sustainability, ESG are sort of no-go words.
Yeah.
So what's your marketing suggestion as we think about, again, the critical issues of the importance of the grid, the fact that it's not a Republican or Democrat issue? So would you suggest we rebrand our conversations to make sure that we're not losing this battle against transmission, new technology, and all of that?
No, it's a fair point. When I was studying geology, we didn't call it, I'd never heard the term climate change. We called it the greenhouse effect. But there was a lot of pretty detailed predictions back in the early 1980s of what kinds of things would be the consequence if we didn't address it more rapidly. And most of those have come true in a really, I would say from a scientific point of view, a surprising level of accuracy. So that doesn't answer your question in terms of how do we, now there's leadership coming in that is much more skeptical about climate change. There are certain facts that can be held up that say, oh, well, that part is not happening as fast. And it's when someone's talking about global warming and you're sitting in the Chicago airport and it's -12 outside, and it's, these are inconsistencies in a lot of people's minds. I continue to think that even when you have a swing in the pendulum, you shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And certainly I think we've kind of overcompensated for some of these things. The pushback on DEI, right? Diversity. When I was mayor, I came in and made it a point that I was going to hire as diverse a cabinet and senior staff as I possibly could. But in every case, I would hire the best person. I would never sacrifice or compromise excellence for the sake of diversity.